Hello, and thank you for coming along again. Today we're going to look at African historical cartography and the ways of developing the means to explore new narratives in African and global ecological history. We're all accustomed to looking at maps of Africa that have been made in the past. They usually illustrate books and often are put into texts for us to look at things like the history of the slave trade. But they're used more as illustrations than they are as documents to analyze. And that's what's changed in the last few years. In effect, there are new techniques and technologies that have been applied, including those of Google Earth, that now make it possible to make use of historical maps of Africa in a brand new way. They can, for example, map on top of Google Earth images specific maps covering particular regions with particular and particularized latitude and longitude definitions so that there can be a precise mapping of layers of African history. These are quite interesting when they're looked at in detail, especially if they're blown up in the Google Earth environment to look at particular regions like river systems, for example, or forests or deserts. You can map on top of that river system that can be viewed from space in Google Earth, a map from the early 1700s, for example, and learn a great deal about what was going on then and what has happened since by peeling off that layer of the map and examining much more closely from Google Earth what's happening on the ground in our contemporary world. This is what people in the Africa Map Circle are engaged in doing. And it's only because of the new digital technology that this is possible. What is the Africa Map Circle? Fair enough, it's a good question. Let's take a look. Basically, the African continent was arguably the first one in the world to be mapped in its full outline, that is, around all of its parameters. It took America a great deal longer to be mapped around all of its parameters, and even Australia, or for that matter, mainland Asia. This is putting Africa in a very interesting and unique position in terms of the history of cartography of the world. Because not only was it the first, those maps were largely created by non-Africans. This has to do with the history of European discovery and expansion in Africa, but it has to do with a lot of other things too, namely the development of technology capable of mapping and presenting those maps in printed form. Therefore, Africa maps can only be understood as multicultural documents from the get-go. Most of the early maps recorded names of places, for example, but place names didn't mean much to the Europeans who recorded them. They can't really be understood unless the African languages, which they were trying to transcribe, are understood. So in many respects, the earliest maps of Africa have to be read back to the Europeans by those in the African language traditions that know what is being referred to. This means that the study of African maps are multicultural studies from the beginning. They require international and multicultural teams of students and scholars to be analyzed adequately. Digital technology now makes it possible to share and analyze these maps around the globe. This puts Africa into a very interesting circumstance in the history of cartography. The result is that the collaborative study of African maps can now provide a new paradigm for the international and multicultural teaching and learning on all levels, not just about Africa, but techniques developed here can be extended elsewhere in the world to expand international and multicultural teaching and learning. This has become particularly apparent during the recent lockdown because of COVID-19. On a global basis, we've had to hunker down, shelter in place, as it was called. And much of the educational institutions, from elementary schools right through universities and graduate schools, have had to learn a new way to learn. Learning under lockdown has taught us a lot. And we've had to develop tools and tips for online learning about Africa from all over the world because trips to Africa were severely limited. And trips of Africans out of Africa to the rest of the world were also severely limited. So much of the normal educational exchange about and with Africa has been curtailed. It's in this environment that new techniques have been devised digitally to exchange information and expand and extend research. Furthermore, these can be made available internationally through images that include QR codes. These codes can be scanned in by intelligent smartphones or iPads or scanning devices of another kind that devise to connect directly to computers that can then interpret the code and get you straight to new source material. We'll see how this is important over time. This is demonstrated in the United States in the meetings of the African Studies Association, where they had to go virtual for the first time. They weren't in-person meetings. They had to be held online. So they were virtual meetings. And in the African Studies Association in 2020, there was convened a very important demonstration of this technology called Online Research and Teaching with Africa Maps, Tips, Techniques, Examples, and Resources, coordinated by the Africa Map Circle. Okay, now we know what the African Map Circle is, but what can it do for students and scholars? Well, you could scan in the code and learn a little bit more on your own about this, but let's do an overview of this. Basically, you can learn about the online research, teaching, and techniques that were discussed at that African Studies meeting in November of 2020. You can get access to that through the QR code and start exploring the different assets for looking at African maps. Basically, the Africa Map Circle developed a series called Explorations, and they combined this with Zoom technology to be able to share experience across great distances, in fact, across the whole of the United States and internationally in the African Studies meeting. People could log in at a particular time and place to the event and share in the webcast or broadcast, and later it became a webcast, to see what was going on and being discussed among those who were talking about particular maps of Africa. The study of European archival collections underscores the importance of these new techniques and technologies. Consider, for example, the forthcoming exhibit planned by one of Oxford's most prestigious colleges. This is, in fact, very important in terms of the exchange of information internationally. The Balliol Historic Collections have decided to put on a display entitled Slavery in the Age of Revolution. And they put a trailer for it out on YouTube, which can be viewed by anyone in the world. It's a kind of invitation to come and view the collection that they're going to display in September 2021. Let's have a look at what they intend to display. The presentation of these kinds of historically important maps and documents from libraries, museums, and private collections around the world can be discussed in the African Map Circle series of online sessions called Explorations. And by way of extending these techniques, entire exhibitions can be presented and later explored on their own by users on their own time. That is to say, they don't have to be at specific moments, but as open exhibits online through interactive online platforms designed in conjunction with YouTube or other online video environments like Vimeo. In this case, the YouTube platform for the Africa Map Circle is a group called Explorations and the Exploration Series, through which you can get access to the exhibit from Harvard. It was a group exhibition of the Hutchins Center. The Hutchins Center has within it a group called the History Design Studio, or HDS. And in the spring of 2019, the 17th of May, they put together a webcast and a walkthrough of the exhibit. In this in-person exhibit and online exhibit, installations included cartographic narratives, an innovative idea there in itself, from both sides of the Atlantic slave trade system, inspired by the work of Harvard professor Vincent Brown. Let's take a look at what he's presented. It was an exhibit in part sponsored by Henry Louis Gates, as well as Professor Vincent Brown, and placed in the center that Henry Louis Gates Jr. is director of, that is the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. It was called Footprints Across Time, because it was both across time in terms of spanning several centuries and across oceans, across continents. Yet another approach to the presentation of art and history has been pioneered by another Harvard professor, actually, Harvard professor Vincent Brown. He's a specialist on Jamaica and has done a very interesting, close study, and he calls it a cartographic narrative. Now, a cartographic narrative is quite an innovation in itself. It's a narrative of maps, and a particular map that he looks at in detail that gives information about the 1760-61 slave revolt in Jamaica. His work on this was really quite inspiring and led, among other things, for people to start to think how to use maps in public displays. There's an animated thematic map that narrates the spatial history of the greatest slave insurrection in the 18th century British Empire. It sort of goes day by day, week by week, month by month during that revolt, and it's a very clever historical analysis. So clever that, in fact, it's gone on to inspire greater things at Harvard. Professor Brown's been put in charge of, he's the director now, of a whole group called the History Design Studio. And it's experimented, this group has, with innovative approaches to present both art and history in the last several years. In fact, the public's understanding of history in the digital age has been significantly advanced with Harvard's History Design Studio, not only with Vincent Brown, but with his two very capable assistants and graduate students in their own right, Amy Alamu and Robin McDowell. They have just, in fact, put on a 2019 group exhibit, which the two of them curated with great skill, called Footprints Across Time. Professor Henry Louis Gates came to the opening of it and was very proud to be seen with and hear about the work done by Vincent Brown and these curatorial assistants. It was quite an event at the time. One of the exhibits, and it was only one of 10, there are 10 different components to this group exhibit, but one of them had to do with maps, stones, and plants, and the analysis of their role as agents of empire and the ecology of the Atlantic trade. Each item in this particular exhibit, part of the larger group exhibit, had a label with one or more QR codes on it. This, in a sense, was the innovation of this particular exhibit, because
QR codes are the kinds of things that can take you beyond the gallery space into other space very quickly. You don't need to teach high school students how to use a cell phone. They know how to use cell phones, and they know what QR codes are. And they're always capturing them wherever they go, and they might as well start capturing them in museum space. So in this particular exhibit, viewers were invited to capture the QR code on their iPhones and then connect through the internet, Harvard's internet, to either historical or contemporary material related to the object in the exhibit. In this sense, the exhibit itself transcended the room in which it was housed. It moved into other space. Viewers were imaginatively transported from the gallery space itself to realities outside the gallery, directly related to the history and ecology of the slave trade and its aftermath throughout West Africa. You can take a look at some of the documents, and they're actually pretty interesting to zoom in on. In fact, you have to zoom in on them to understand them. This is why it was necessary to develop these QR codes in order to give people the chance to look at expanded versions of these original documents. Here you can see, for example, ships off the coast of West Africa near Mina, which is a town. El Mina is a town in the current state of Ghana, was known then as the Gold Coast. And the annotation in this illustration from the travelogue that this is an indication of fishing canoes off Mina, 500 or 600 of them at a time. Well, you can bet they're fishing for more than just their own consumption. 600 canoes out there fishing, getting a lot of fish. Well, as it turns out, in reference to the slave trade, as we know here in Boston, salted cod is one of the staples of international travel, naval travel. And this was a whole industry providing protein to the transatlantic trade. It's the kind of thing you can only get by expanding the original document and looking at it in detail. Same document has on the lower half of it a very interesting representation of another thing going on at the coast. And if you read the the annotation under it, under Part B, it's Negroes' canoes carrying slaves on board of ships at Manfro. Well, Manfro is this castle over to the right, and they're being brought out from the castle to be loaded onto the European ships. They're being paddled out. Here's the indication of the slaves, B. This is the slaves. These are the freemen doing the paddling. Very interesting division of labor here, and only visible if you blow these up. And this is why the QR codes were provided for viewers to be able to do this. You can look in even greater detail on the blown up versions available through the internet connection of the QR code and see what's going on in terms of conversations, or at least the representations of conversations and reflection of slaves about to be put on the ships. Fascinating. Has a lot more to do with European imagery of what was going on than it does with maybe what was going on. In fact, there's no representation of shackles here, for example. This is not a photograph. It's a piece of art. It's a representation, a representation, and needs to be understood as that. But you got the idea. If you looked at the labels in any one of the exhibit items, it had within it this kind of square code, and the QR codes empowered the viewers to get outside the gallery context and view the original documents and their historical context. By their historical context, I also mean that it enabled people to look at the geographical context. If you scan in this kind of QR code, you can be taken into space and view that slave castle from above. The hyperlinks were also provided for people to look at things in detail. Now, history in the digital age has always involved new technologies, new data, new insights, and of course, new questions that come out of all of that. But with the exhibit techniques combined with these new sources of data and new kinds of questions, you have a very innovative way of engaging audiences in museums in ways that they've never been asked to participate in previous instances. For example, the display techniques in this exhibit provided a new way to look at old maps, wherever viewers encounter them. These obviously are maps of West Africa, maps from the early 1800s. They're laid on top of what? Well, you can see it. It's a view of Google Earth. So you can zoom into these maps and zoom into Google Earth underneath it, peel off the map, and see where it was relating to specific spots which are now viewable from space. But you're not limited to doing this in Africa, obviously. This is the case of the material provided in this exhibit, but the same kind of linkage between the object, its representation, a QR code to the original, and all of the context you wanted to build behind that original is available for any part of the world. You could take it up in West Africa as this exhibit did, but you could do it for the Mediterranean or for New York or Boston Harbor or anything you wanted to relate your museum exhibit to. It's the technology that's interesting here and the innovation of using QR codes as the means of transcending the gallery space to some kind of reality. So, from gallery to reality and back, how can this code help us experience Botticelli more completely? Well, scan it in and find out. Or how can the lower code help us view the wider world and the history of the slave trade? Well, this is why the display of art and the art of display in the digital age has really changed the nature of our encounter both within museums and the importance of museums for our understanding the wider world.
Well, this was presented on Cambridge Community Television, a group that calls itself the Voice and Vision of Cambridge. So it got well beyond the academic circles. It was both a public exhibit and an academic scholarly exhibit. The digital technology allowed the bridging between those two communities quite gracefully. In fact, the digital technology now makes this possible in virtually every field. In fact, it's now becoming more and more required and expected of collections of all kinds. To be able to move from gallery to reality and back, museums are rethinking the display of art and the art of display in the digital age. And they're using things like QR codes to make things more accessible, both within the exhibit and more generally to the public. Instant digital integration through QR codes makes it possible to link into exhibits that are in-person exhibits in the galleries themselves, and those exhibits can link directly with the wider world context and deliver information across the world through cell phone technology. So, although this was broadcast across the Cambridge Community Television and available only to members of the Cambridge community, it could be posted and was through cell phone technology and instant digital integration of the QR code, linking it to a webcast that could then be picked up by cell phones, both within Cambridge, around the United States, and across the world through the exploration series of the Africa Map Circle. In effect, We can now span oceans and bridge traditions to enhance the study of African historical cartography by integrating collections from different university libraries, for example, many of which have specialized collections, both in terms of geography and in terms of African studies. Furthermore, those can be extended well beyond the university level to anyone with access to a cell phone and the internet, to countries across the world that have no universities that wish to use this kind of material in teaching high school or even elementary school level information to students in their care. In effect, the exploration series begins to enable teachers around the world to mobilize this material. In Africa, anyone with a video cell phone and access to the internet can now get to learn about African historical cartography. This is likely to change the awareness of new generations of students who will learn from and contribute to the study of African history. These students know languages that none of the European students or the Americans, or very few of them, know. As a result, some of the early maps make sense to them in a way that they're opaque to both Americans and European students who need the assistance of these students in Africa to be able to make sense of the maps that are historically generated and now stored in collections in Western libraries. Basically, this is a universal and expanding phenomena around the world. As historical cartography is made more accessible to cell phones, it will have the potential to change cultural awareness in every culture, whether that's in Asia, in the Western countries, or in India, the Middle East, South America, around the world, in effect, because this communication technology can now be hitched to and expanded with digitization technology that makes documents and their presentation and discussion available to all cultures at all levels.
The work of history in the digital age, in this sense, has contributed a great deal to a new kind of citizen science alliance that's emerging around the world.